The marble counter at the Amtrak first-class desk gleamed under brass lamps, and the clerk's manicured fingers slid Owen Callahan's veteran ID back across it without warmth. "Upgrades are gone, sir." Her eyes flicked once over his frayed flannel, the welder's burn scars on his knuckles, the 7-year-old boy clutching a torn picture book at his hip, and dismissed all three in a single breath. Behind him, heels clicked on polished stone. A woman in a cream blazer set down a Chanel handbag, slid a platinum card across the marble, and was checked into her first-class cabin in 14 seconds. The clerk smiled at her. She did not smile at Owen. He said nothing. He only tightened his grip on his son's small hand and turned toward Coach, the cuff of his flannel slipping back just enough to catch the light on a steel bracelet. 2 words engraved across it that no one bothered to read. The coach car smelled of old upholstery and lukewarm coffee, and Owen Callahan settled his son into the window seat without speaking. Jake pressed his forehead to the glass, the picture book balanced on his knees, with both covers half detached, held together with masking tape Owen had reapplied the night before. The boy's breath fogged a small circle on the window. Outside, the platform at Memphis Central shrank behind them as the train pulled out and bent south toward Mississippi. Owen's hands rested on his thighs, the burn scars across his knuckles pale against weather-worn skin. He had not slept much. He rarely did before any kind of journey now. The bracelet beneath his cuff sat heavier than its weight should have allowed. He had bought the ticket 6 weeks ago after his father-in-law's last phone call, the one where the old man's voice had finally cracked. Kara had been gone 6 years. The grandfather had never met Jake. Owen had postponed the trip twice before once, because he could not afford the fare, once, because he could not afford the conversation. This time, he had said yes before he could think about it. And now they were riding the rails south, because Owen had not stepped onto an aircraft of any kind since the day a folded flag had been pressed into his hands at Arlington. Kara had been the better pilot. He had told her so on their wedding day, and meant it. She had flown the heavy gray transports no one wrote songs about, and she had set hers down on a desert strip under fire to lift Owen's wounded squadron out of a place that should have killed them. 3 weeks later, on a routine resupply, her aircraft had been hit on the climb out. There had been no body to bring home, only the flag and the bracelet on Owen's wrist, and the small boy who had been 13 months old when his mother stopped existing. Owen had flown one more sortie after the funeral. He had handed in his wings the following morning. The Air Force had let him go without argument, because anyone with eyes could see what was already broken. He moved to Memphis because the rent was cheap, and no one there knew his name, and he took a job hammering hot steel in a small fabrication shop because the work needed nothing of him except his hands. Jake reached over and touched the back of Owen's wrist, where the bracelet was hidden. The boy had learned somewhere along the way that touching it made his father look at him. "Dad," Jake said. "Will Granddad like me?" Owen turned his head. His son's hair was the same color as Kara's, which was a fact that arrived new and painful at unexpected hours of the day. "He's going to love you," Owen answered. "He's been waiting a long time." Jake nodded, the way children nod when they have decided to believe something, and returned to his book. Owen watched the Tennessee bottomland slide past the bracelet warm against his skin, and did not think about the woman in the cream blazer 2 cars ahead sitting in the seat. The clerk at Memphis Central had told him did not exist. The trouble started before they had been moving 20 minutes. A man in a Navy windbreaker stopped beside their row holding a printed boarding pass, his expression shaped by the polite confusion of someone who did not want to fight, but also did not intend to stand. "I think you're in my seat, sir." Owen looked down at his own ticket. The seat numbers matched. So did the car. He showed the stranger the printout. The stranger showed his. The numbers were identical. "Let me find the conductor," Owen said. The conductor came down the aisle a few minutes later, a heavy-set man in his 50s with steady gray eyes and a name tag that read, Daniel Walker. He held a tablet in one hand. He looked at both tickets tapped to the screen, frowned, tapped it again. Then he looked at Owen, took in the frayed flannel and the welder's hands resting protectively on Jake's shoulder, and finally noticed the boy clutching the torn picture book against his chest. System double-booked the row, Walker said quietly. Happens when manifest updates don't sync between counters. I'll take care of it. He gestured for Owen to follow. They moved through 2 cars, Jake pressed close against his father's leg, and stopped only when Walker pushed open the heavy door at the front of the first-class car. The temperature dropped. The carpet thickened. Brass fittings caught the overhead light. There's a row open near the rear of this car, Walker said. Should have been offered to you at the counter back in Memphis. I read the system note. You were eligible. Owen began to protest. Walker raised one hand. This isn't a favor, sir. It's a correction. Please. The conductor walked them to the empty row, made sure Jake was settled by the window, and tipped his cap before turning back toward the front of the train. Owen lowered himself into the seat, slowly, the bracelet pressing into the soft underside of his wrist, and tried not to look around at a cabin he had no business sitting in. Across the narrow aisle, a woman in a cream blazer was speaking into a phone. He recognized the Chanel handbag on the seat beside her before he recognized the face. She had not noticed them yet. No, the renegotiation is fine, she was saying. The Pentagon people will sign by Friday. They always do. They sign anything as long as the language flatters them. Her laugh was short and untroubled. Honestly, half these so-called pilots are just operators of the equipment my company designs. They aren't engineers. They aren't strategists. They press buttons. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Owen's jaw set. He kept his eyes on the back of the seat in front of him. The call ended. The woman looked up. Her gaze traveled across Owen's flannel, the boy's torn book, the empty space where polished luggage should have been. Her expression did not change. It calcified. I'm sorry, she said loud enough for the row ahead to hear. Is this the right car for you? Conductor seated us, Owen replied. She turned slightly in her seat, pulled the handbag a fraction closer, and addressed no one in particular. I do wish they would think harder about the experience of paying customers. Jake, who had been arranging his book on the tray table, knocked his small cup of orange juice with the corner of it. The juice spread fast across the polished wood and dripped onto the carpet between the seats. The boy's face went white. He looked at his father, then at the woman, and his mouth opened without producing any sound. She stood. The blazer moved sharply with her expensive fabric catching the light. This is exactly why, she announced to the cabin. Children of a certain background should not be in first class. You don't teach them. You don't train them. And the rest of us pay for it. Owen felt every muscle in his shoulders lock. Years of swallowing came up against the boy at his elbow, the boy whose face had just folded inward, like paper, crumpling the boy who was leaning slowly away from the woman, as if her words had a temperature he could feel. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He had learned somewhere in the years between Kara's flag, and now that his voice no longer carried weight in rooms like this. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said. I'll clean it up. He took the napkins from the tray, bent forward, and wiped the wood and the carpet, while she watched, arms crossed her face, composed in a thin satisfaction. Jake leaned in close to Owen's ear when she sat back down. His voice was very small. Dad, can we go back to the other car? Owen did not answer at once. He folded the wet napkins into a neat square and set them aside. Then he put his arm around his son's shoulders and pulled him in tight against his side. Something inside him was beginning to crack along a line he had not known was there. The intercom crackled before he could find words for the boy. The conductor's voice came through careful in a way Owen recognized at once, the voice of a man choosing his sentences while reading from a script someone else had written. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your conductor speaking. Due to a regional security incident affecting the rail corridor ahead, This train will be making an unscheduled stop near Columbus, Mississippi. Per federal protocol, all passengers will be temporarily transferred to a secure facility at Columbus Air Force Base while the corridor is cleared. We expect the delay to be brief. Please remain in your seats until further instructions." The cabin reacted as cabins do. The woman across the aisle began dialing. A businessman 2 rows up demanded to know what regional security incident meant. A young couple tried to soothe a startled toddler. Owen heard none of it clearly. He had gone very still in his seat, the napkin still folded in his hand. He knew the cadence of that announcement. He knew it the way a sailor knows weather. The conductor had not said sensor failure. He had not said track obstruction. He had said federal protocol, which meant the order had come from above the railroad. He had said secure facility, which meant the base had cleared its perimeter for civilian intake. None of that happened for a malfunction. That happened for an unidentified airborne object on a corridor the Air Force did not want shared airspace contested over. Owen had spent 13 years writing the kind of orders that triggered exactly that kind of language. Jake looked up at him. "Dad, are we okay?" "We're fine, buddy. They're being careful. We'll get off the train for a little while, and then we'll get back on." "Where are we going?" Owen did not answer immediately. His hand went without his permission to the cuff of his flannel. The bracelet beneath it felt warm. He pulled the cuff a 1/4 inch lower, covering the metal completely, and lowered his hand again. "An Air Force base," he said. Jake's eyes widened. "A real one with airplanes." With airplanes. Outside, the train was already slowing. Owen could feel the brakes engaging through the floor, that particular long deceleration that meant the engineer was being talked down to a precise stop point. Through the window beyond a tree line, he caught a flash of pale concrete and the edge of a tower he had once known by sight. Columbus Air Force Base, the schoolhouse where the Air Force taught every man and every woman who would ever fly a fighter for the United States. The base, where in another life Owen Callahan had stood at the front of a briefing room and taught close-quarters air combat to officers who were now squadron commanders. The base where his name was still printed on the first page of a manual that learner pilots opened on their second day of school. He had spent 6 years making sure no one ever found him. The world had just steered itself onto a track that ended at his front door. The choice was simple and impossible at once. Stay invisible, or let his son see who his father had been. The base reception hall had been built for visitors who arrived with appointments. It was not built for 63 civilians wheeling overnight bags off an Amtrak coach. Folding chairs had been hauled out and arranged in uneven rows along one wall. A pair of airmen stood at the doorways with clipboards and the kind of bored alertness that came from being pulled off a real task to chaperone strangers. Owen kept his cap low and steered Jake toward the farthest corner. The chair he chose put his back to the wall and his shoulder angled away from the room. It was an old habit, and he had not realized it was still his until his body completed the motion before he could think about it. He set the picture book on Jake's lap and crouched to retie the laces on his son's small sneakers. Above him, somewhere outside the building's east wall, an engine spooled up. He recognized the sound, the way most men recognized their own front door closing. A Pratt & Whitney F. 119 on idle climbing now to taxi power, a Raptor going hot. Within a minute he heard the second one, a flight of 2 prepping to roll. Routine training cycle mid-morning slot. He realized his hand had stopped on Jake's laces. His fingers had remembered the rhythm before his mind had named the engines. "Dad." Jake was watching him. "Yeah, buddy. Do you know about those airplanes?" Owen finished the second knot and stayed crouched a moment longer than he needed to. The honest answer rose in his throat, the way a thing long held under pressure rises when the lid finally moves. He had been saying no to questions like that for years. He had said no when the boy asked about the framed wings packed in a box in the closet. He had said no when Jake had pointed at a fighter jet flyover at a county fair last fall. The boy's eyes that morning had been holding still since the woman in the cream blazer stood up and announced that he did not belong. They were holding still now in a different way. They were waiting to see if the man crouched in front of him was going to tell the truth. Owen straightened. He sat down beside his son and pulled him under one arm. "A little," he said. "I knew about airplanes once." Jake leaned into him and did not press for more. Across the room, the woman in the cream blazer had taken a chair near the window and was speaking into her phone in the clipped, irritated cadence of someone repeating herself for the third time. Her words landed like hail on glass, and Owen barely heard them. He had begun without meaning to count the airmen at the doors and to map the room's exits. The skill came back unbidden, a muscle that had never forgotten its shape, and he hated that part of him for waking now, when he had spent so long teaching it to sleep. The side door at the far end of the hall opened, and a man in a flight suit came through it. He was tall, and lean helmet tucked under one arm, the green G-suit chaps still strapped to his thighs. His name tape read, "Rias," and the captain's bars on his chest caught the fluorescent light as he stepped into the room. He had the unhurried alertness of a pilot who had landed within the hour and was still partly inside the cockpit. He moved to the front of the hall and addressed the civilians in a calm, practiced voice. The corridor was being cleared. The delay would not exceed 2 hours. Refreshments and restrooms were available through the doors marked. He thanked them for their patience. Then he began to walk the rows. He was not searching for anyone. Owen could see that. The man was simply doing what pilots did in unfamiliar rooms, taking in faces. Hands postured the small data of a crowd. His eyes moved at the speed of habit. They stopped on Owen. Specifically, they stopped on Owen's left wrist, where the cuff of the flannel had ridden up an inch when he had reached around Jake's shoulders. The steel bracelet showed beneath it the engraving angled toward the room. Captain Marcus Reyes did not move for a count of 3. Then he came down the row. He stopped 2 feet from Owen's chair. He did not speak right away. He looked at the bracelet, then at Owen's face, and something in his own face changed by small degrees, like a man arriving at the end of a long arithmetic problem. "Sir," he said. His voice was lower than it had been at the front of the room. "I'm sorry to bother you. Is that your call sign on that bracelet, or are you wearing it for someone else?" Jake was looking up at his father. The picture book sat closed on his lap. Owen felt the room tighten around him. The woman in the cream blazer had stopped speaking into her phone. He could feel the weight of strangers turning in their chairs without yet understanding what they were turning toward. He could have lifted his cuff and said it was his brother's. He had said worse things to keep himself buried. He looked at Jake. Kara had flown into a wall of fire because she had decided he was worth landing for. She had not done that so that he could spend the rest of his life pretending the man she had loved no longer existed. "It's mine," Owen said. The words came out quietly, but they did not waver. "Ghost 6, Lieutenant Colonel Owen Callahan, 27th Fighter Squadron, retired 6 years. Captain Reyes came to attention. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a man does a thing he wants done correctly. His heels touched, his shoulders squared. His right hand rose to the brim of a cap he was not wearing, and he held the salute. "Sir," he said loud enough now for the whole room to hear. "I learned close quarters air combat from the manual you wrote. Every pilot in my squadron did. It is an honor." He keyed the radio clipped to his shoulder and spoke into it briefly. Words Owen could not quite catch. Then he stood at attention and waited. What happened next happened fast, but it had the strange slowness of a thing seen through clear water. The side door opened again. 3 more pilots came through it, all of them in flight suits, all of them at a half jog that became a measured stride 3 steps into the room. Behind them came an older man with silver at his temples and full colonel's eagles on his shoulders. Owen knew the eagles before he knew the face. The face he placed a heartbeat later. Brett Holloway, Holloway had been a major when Owen had last seen him 8 years ago, in a briefing room 2 buildings west of where they now stood. Holloway did not break stride. He came down the aisle between the folding chairs, and the 3 pilots came with him, and they stopped in a half circle around Owen's row. The colonel took in the welder's hands, the frayed flannel, the boy with the picture book, and the bracelet on the wrist. Then he came to attention. The 3 pilots followed him a half-second later. Captain Reyes, who had not moved, held his salute steady. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan. Holloway set his voice, carrying the full carry of a parade ground, without rising in volume. This base owes you a great deal more than this room can hold. Welcome back, sir. The civilians in the hall had gone silent. Some of them had stood up without realizing they had stood up. A woman 2 rows back was holding one hand over her mouth. In the chair near the window, the woman in the cream blazer had let her phone slip out of her hand. It landed on the carpet with a small sound that no one else in the room registered. Her face had gone white in a particular way, the way of a person whose understanding of a situation was rebuilding itself in real time and finding that none of the new pieces fit the old frame. Jake was looking up at his father with his mouth slightly open. He did not understand the rank. He did not understand the words on the bracelet. He understood with the perfect clarity of a child that every grown person in the room was standing for his dad. Owen returned the salute. His hand came up the way it had not come up in years, and it did not shake. Colonel Holloway did not insist. He invited. The corridor would be cleared in roughly 90 minutes, he said. There was a briefing room 2 buildings over, coffee that was better than what the reception hall could offer, a few pilots who would consider it a privilege if the lieutenant colonel had time. Jake was welcome. Captain Reyes had a son the same age and would happily mind him in the squadron lounge. Owen looked at Jake. Jake looked back steady now in a way he had not been all morning and gave a small nod. Owen rose. The briefing room had not changed in 8 years. The same long table, the same wall of screens, the same faint smell of dry erase marker and aviation coffee. The chairs around the table were filled with pilots in their 20s and early 30s, men and women who had stood when he entered and who were still standing when Holloway gestured for them to sit. Captain Reyes was not among them. He was down the hall with Jake, and Owen had heard, as he passed the lounge door, the small sound of his son laughing at something a stranger in a flight suit had said. Holloway took a seat at the side of the table and did not speak. He had cleared the floor for Owen without saying so. Owen had stood in front of rooms like this hundreds of times. He had taught threat geometry, energy management, the specific sequence of decisions that kept a man alive in a cockpit in the last 8 seconds of a fight he was losing. He could have done that now without preparation. He had walked in expecting to do exactly that. He had a half-dozen comfortable sentences ready about honor and tradition and the next generation of the squadron. He looked at the faces around the table. They were waiting. They had read his manual. Some of them were alive because of an egress procedure he had written after a bad night in a country he no longer named out loud. They were not waiting for honor and tradition. They had honor and tradition. They were waiting for him. He set his hands flat on the table. The burned scars showed against the dark wood. "I left the service because I broke," he said. "Not because my time was up. I want to say that first, because everything else I tell you depends on it." The room did not move. My wife was Captain Kara Callahan. She flew C-17s out of Charleston. 6 years ago, she put hers down on a strip in northeastern Africa that was being walked in by mortar fire because my squadron was on that strip, and we were not getting off it any other way. She lifted us out. 3 weeks later, on a routine resupply, her aircraft took a man-portable surface-to-air on the climb. There was no recovery. He kept his eyes on the wood. I flew one more sortie after the funeral. The next morning, I handed in my wings. I moved to Memphis because no one there knew me. I've been hammering steel in a fabrication shop ever since. I take home a little under $31,000 a year. My son wears shoes I buy at a thrift store. I have told myself every day that this is what a man who lived through what I lived through deserves. Somewhere in the row across from him, a young captain set his coffee cup down and didn't pick it up again. "I was wrong about that," Owen said. "I'm not standing here to tell you I figured it out. I'm telling you I was wrong, and that I'm afraid my son has been paying for it. That's the honest version. The rest of what I know about flying, I'll give you any day you ask. But I owed you that part first." The room held its silence the way a hangar holds the quiet after a launch. Colonel Holloway waited until the pilots had filed out before he spoke. The two men were left in the briefing room with the light slanting across the table and the smell of cooling coffee. "There is a program," Holloway said. "Civilian Tactical Advisor. We have funding for it, and we have never had the right name to put on the line. The work is what you would expect. You write the scenarios, you sit in on debriefs, you red team the egress procedures, you walk into rooms like this one and you tell young people the truth they need to hear before they go fly. The contract is dignified. The salary is enough that your son does not wear thrift store shoes." He let that sit on the table without pushing it. "You can stay in Memphis. We bring you up 2 days a week. We pay the travel. The position is yours if you want it. It has been yours in everything but paperwork since the day you walked off this base." Owen looked at his hands on the wood. He thought about the small house he rented and the cracked driveway where Jake rode a second-hand bike. He thought about the picture book held together with masking tape. He thought about Kara, who had not put her aircraft into a wall of fire so that her husband could spend the next 40 years teaching himself he did not deserve to eat. He had been ready when he sat down in this room to give the squadron the manual and walk back to the train. He had thought of this stop as something to survive. He understood now that the world had not steered the train onto this base by accident, in any sense that mattered. The world had simply stopped letting him stay invisible. His son had seen him saluted. His son had watched him salute back. There was no road from this room that led back to the man who had sat down at Memphis Central that morning. "I need to think about it," Owen said. "Take the train home," Holloway answered. "Call me Monday." Owen rose. The bracelet under his cuff was warm against his wrist, and for the first time in a long while, it did not feel like a thing he was carrying for someone who was gone. The corridor reopened a little after 1 in the afternoon. The civilians were funneled back through the gates with the patient choreography of people who had been told only as much as they needed to know, and the train sat waiting on the spur line where it had stopped its windows, catching the high midday sun. Captain Reyes walked Jake out personally and shook his small hand at the gate, as if he had been entrusted with something precious and was returning it intact. Jake's picture book was tucked under one arm. Someone had reinforced the spine with a strip of cloth tape that looked suspiciously like the sort kept on a flight line. Owen was a few steps behind, carrying their single overnight bag, when he saw the cream blazer waiting on the curb. Claudia Weston had recovered most of her composure since the reception hall. The phone was back in her hand. The Chanel bag was back on her shoulder. But her eyes were not the eyes she had worn that morning. They had been corrected the way a fracture is corrected. The set of her mouth was different. She stepped forward as Owen approached, and she did not block his path, but she stood close enough that he would have to walk around her to keep moving. "Mr. Callahan." Her voice was lower now. "Lieutenant Colonel, I owe you an apology. I owe your son one." Owen set the bag down on the pavement and rested one hand on Jake's shoulder. He did not answer at once. He had been on the receiving end of a great many apologies over the years, most of them issued quickly, so the person could feel relieved of them. He had learned to recognize the texture of that kind, and this one had some of it. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not the person you owe. I know. Your son. I'm prepared to make a contribution to a veterans fund in his name, a significant one. I would also like to write a personal letter to your family. I want to do whatever you believe is appropriate." Jake had gone very still under his father's hand. He was watching the woman the way a child watches a dog he has been bitten by, once calculating whether the second approach is safe. Owen looked at her for a long moment. "You make linchpin avionics for the F-22, he said. "Your company has held that contract for 14 years. I flew the airframe your boards live inside. So did the 4 officers who saluted me this morning. 3 hours ago, I sat across from you and listened to you tell someone on the phone that pilots are operators of the equipment your company designs. You said it twice. You said it loud enough that my son heard it." She started to speak. He did not raise his voice, but he did not let her into the sentence. "I'm not asking you to apologize to me, ma'am. What you did to me, I have done to myself for a long time. I can carry it. What you did to him is different. You made a 7-year-old boy believe he didn't have permission to sit in a chair he had a ticket for. That isn't a mistake you fix with a check. What do you want me to do? I want you to go home and look at how your company treats the veterans on its hiring roles, the ones in the warehouses, the ones in the technician lines, the ones who came out of the service with skills your engineers don't have and got passed over because their resumes don't read like Stanford. Don't write a check to a fund. Don't put my name on a press release. Go fix the thing your company is actually doing. That's the apology I'll accept, and I won't be checking, because it isn't owed to me. It's owed to the people you've already overlooked." Her face had gone still. She did not argue. She did not nod. She looked at Jake, and then she looked at Owen, and she gave a single small inclination of her head and stepped back to let him pass. He picked up the bag. He walked his son to the train. The trip to New Orleans took the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening. Kara's father met them on the platform, under a yellow sodium light, a tall, thin man in a cardigan who looked at his grandson for a long second before he knelt to the boy's height and said simply, "Hello, Jake. I'm so glad you came." He did not let go of the boy's hand for the entire walk to the parking lot, and when he hugged Owen at the car, he held on a count longer than expected and did not say anything about it. They stayed 3 days. The old man and Jake sat on the back porch with a deck of cards and a chipped pitcher of lemonade, and Kara's name was spoken between them more in those 3 days than it had been spoken in Owen's house in 3 years. It was a beginning. Owen called Colonel Holloway on Monday from the kitchen of the small rental while Jake was at school. The conversation was short. Yes meant yes. Holloway did not make a speech of it. The first paychecks were strange in his hands. The first month, he simply paid down the things that had been outstanding. The second month, he bought Jake new sneakers and a backpack that did not have someone else's initials inside the front flap. By the end of the third month, they had moved to a house on the other side of town with a small fenced yard and an oak tree out back, whose lowest branch Jake claimed inside an hour. Owen put up a swing for him on a Saturday morning, and it was the first thing he had built with his hands in a long time that was not built for a stranger's profit. He drove up to Columbus 2 days a week. The work was not difficult in the way the cockpit had been difficult, but it was demanding in a different register. He sat with young pilots in debriefs and walked them through decisions that had no clean answer. He red-teamed the egress procedures and found 2 lines in the current edition that he had written 8 years ago and that needed to be replaced because the airframe had since changed in ways that mattered. He wrote the new lines himself. Captain Reyes called him on a Wednesday in late spring with a question about a training scenario that had gone sideways, and Owen talked him through it from the cab of his truck in a school pickup line. And after he hung up, he sat for a minute with both hands on the steering wheel and understood that he was no longer a ghost in his own life. A morning in autumn, 6 months after the train, Owen opened the Defense News on his kitchen table and found a small article on page 4. Weston Defense Systems had announced a new initiative: priority hiring of veterans into technical and project management roles, a formal review of subcontractor practices. The piece quoted the chief executive officer twice briefly in language that did not sound like a press release. His name was not in the article. He had not been told it was coming. He read it once through, folded the paper in half, and set it aside next to his coffee. He did not feel triumph. He felt something quieter, the way a man feels when a thing he set in motion arrives at a place he will never see and does its work without him. A week later, a woman came into the diner where he and Jake ate Saturday breakfast. She was middle-aged and wore a coat too warm for the weather, and she stopped beside their booth long enough to say that she had been on the train that day. She did not ask for anything. She told him that the hour she had spent watching pilots stand for him in that reception hall had carried her through a season at her job she had not been sure she would survive, and she thanked him, and she walked out. Jake watched her go and asked who she was. Owen said he didn't know. Then he said, "I think she's all right now." The evening was warm for the season. Jake had eaten and washed and was asleep upstairs in the small back bedroom, the picture book on the nightstand beside him, its spine reinforced now with proper bookbinding tape that Owen had bought from a store across town. On the wall above the boy's dresser, Owen had hung a framed photograph he had not been able to look at since the funeral. Kara stood in front of her C-17 with her helmet under her arm and her flight suit zipped to the throat, and she was laughing at something the photographer had said. The frame was new. The picture was not. Owen sat on the back porch with his phone in his hand. The oak tree threw a long shadow across the yard, and the swing he had hung that spring moved slightly in a breeze too small to be felt anywhere else. He scrolled to a name he had not opened in a very long time. Tom Whitaker had stood beside him. At Kara's funeral had carried one corner of the flag, had called him every Sunday for the first 4 months, and then every other Sunday for 2 months after that, and had finally stopped calling because Owen had stopped picking up. Tom had not stopped being his friend. Owen had simply stopped letting him. He typed the message slowly. "Tom, it's Owen. I know it's been a long time. I'm doing better now. I have a son you've never met, and a porch with an extra chair on it. Come up when you can. The chair has been waiting." He read it once. He sent it. He set the phone face down on the arm of the chair. He did not wait for the reply, because he understood in a way he had not understood that morning at the Memphis Central counter that he had not sent the message in order to be answered. He had sent it because a man who believed his life was a debt he was paying did not write that sentence. He had sent it because he had finally stopped writing that man's name on his own days. The bracelet on his left wrist caught the porch light. Ghost 6. The 2 words were not the name of a man who had died in a desert on a resupply run. They were the name of a man sitting on his own back porch on a warm evening, listening to his son breathe through an open upstairs window, learning slowly how to belong to a life that had not stopped waiting for him to come home.